Thank you very much, Kumagai-san, and it's a real honour for me to be here today to chair this second session. I'm delighted to be joined by colleagues from around the region. So we've just had a very excellent panel on supply chain resilience that showed us how key countries in our region are responding to geopolitical and other disruptions. Many of these are costly self-insurance measures that countries are having to take that we wouldn't actually need, we would not need if we had a well-functioning rules-based international order with the major powers, China and the United States, buying into that system, but more so showing leadership. Instead, of course, we have strategic competition between China and the United States, including the recent escalation of their trade war. We also have the United States upending the system that it led the creation of. That's beyond a Donald Trump phenomenon and likely to be with us for the foreseeable future. So we heard from the first session, countries are taking measures like supply chain resilience through diversification, through intervening in the market much more, of course. Casey talked about concentrated markets, export profiles, but also on the import side. And words and terms like diversification and friendshoring are now with us. But I think we've got to be pretty careful with what we mean by some of these. I agree with Casey, we're not in a first best world, and we have to think about second best policies. But some of these measures are becoming more costly. Diversification is the opposite of specialisation. Specialisation in comparative advantage that has led us to have such high living standards. So you can just think if that progresses even further, we are not in a safer nor more prosperous world. So what I want to do in this session is zoom out in this panel and look at how countries and our region are and should be responding to this broader threat to the international economic order. So we had the sharper choices of supply chain resilience and what's happening, but I want to look at the international order and the rules-based system. And to do that, we have three distinguished panelists. I'll briefly introduce them one by one. The first, we'll introduce them in the order they will speak, but Professor Biswajit from JNU in India. We then have Rebecca Santa Maria, who's the Director, Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs in Malaysia and former Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat. And last but not least, Faculty Fellow of RIETI, Tsuyoshi KAWASE, is also a Professor, Faculty of Law, Sophia University. So we'll kick off with the same 10-minute initial presentations by panelists, and we will start with India and hear how the world looks from the rising power in South Asia. So Biswajit, over to you.
Thank you, Shiro. It's a real honor to be here and to share my thoughts with this very distinguished gathering here. And in what I think is one of the most difficult moments in history, I wouldn't say just post-war history, because a lot of things that are happening go beyond the post-war, sort of economic formation that we had. Now, among the countries that are being affected by this whole geopolitical and economic turmoil, I think India is among the worst. And the reason is that, we, in this whole sort of geopolitical rivalry that we saw, both pre-Cold War and more recently of US and China battling it out, India had made very clear choices, in the sense that in the beginning we had very close ties with the Soviet Union. We were on that other side of the fence. And about 2 decades, from about 2 decades, 3 decades, I would say, we again made a very conscious choice of moving on the other side. And we actually moved towards the U.S., and now we have a very strong, like I said, like I say here, legacy of very strong U.S.-India bilateral relations. Now, it's a very interesting case that we have in India. On the one hand, politically, we are very much aligned to the U.S. We are part of the Quad. Whether it exists or not, we don't know. I don't think it exists in Donald Trump's framework at all. We've been part of IPEF, not very active though, but still part of all the formations that the US was thinking about in its pivot to Asia. So that was a very important, dimension. On the other side, India has been almost completely dependent on China. And China is the largest supplier of intermediate products to India. And so we have this very strange situation that because of its closeness to the US and, of course, a very large Indian diaspora, almost a quarter of India's exports go to just the US, and this has been steadily increasing. And it's happened in the past, is increased in the past few years as China moved away from the US. So as China is decreasing its exposure to the US since Trump won, India has actually increased. And on the other side, almost 17% of India's imports come from China. So we are in the, sort of in the crossfire. And we're facing all kinds of issues. And of course, our traditional relations with Russia continues. And so we are at the, find ourselves the wrong end of the stake on several fronts. So this is what I just mentioned here. And several industries, for instance, when Apple decided to move from China into India, and our production of mobile phones really zoomed, today we find that almost 68% of our, this should go up to 68 now in the latest month's data, but 68% of our mobile phone imports are just going to the US. 40% of our pharmaceutical, these are large industries, and we have large employment in these sectors. These are all dependent on the US. And so, again, as I said, the decline in the US imports from the US really created this issue. Now, India's exports to the US have been quite sluggish. And the reason is that we don't import what US actually wants to offer to us, which is agricultural exports, agricultural products. Our agriculture is dependent on small farmers, and it's a really sensitive political segment. And the government just doesn't want to open that up. On the other hand, India is a large market, a larger provider of professionals, especially to the IT sector. So again, you find, so India wants to send a lot of people to the US, but doesn't want to import agricultural products. And that is the center, sort of key problem that we have been facing. So now under Trump, this relationship between India and the US, of course, it dates back to Trump 1. The Prime Minister and President Trump had excellent relationships, and we thought that it's going to improve, and it did show initial signs of improvement when, the first thing that India did, and Prime Minister Modi went to the US in February, we agreed to start negotiations on a bilateral trade agreement. Now, India hadn't actually even taken an initiative to start a bilateral free trade agreement with the US, its larger trade partner. So very anomalous situation, anomaly was there, but we tried to break that and we started negotiating. So again, we thought that, things will move pretty quickly until the reciprocal tariffs came. And in each of the major statements that President Trump has made since, or his cabinet ministers, they've all been insisting that India imports more of US agricultural products. And that's where the situation really got stuck. And we've been urged to import US soya. Again, as China has moved away from the US, U.S. is wanting India to buy in and to close that gap, that export gap that has been now being caused. So what is the situation today? We face, Trump's, the threat from Trump first on the fact that our bilateral trade negotiations are not going anywhere. And then he's put 25% tariffs. And then he's actually put, this is the highest in South Asia. And then he followed it up with 25% tariffs for importing oil from the U.S., from Russia. Now, again, several countries have been buying oil from Russia post the conflict with Ukraine, but India has been targeted. And my explanation is that that India's refusal to buy petroleum products, agricultural products, is the main reason why this thing has been, the additional tariffs have been imposed. It's nothing to do with Russian oil. And the reason is that, it was in the first place the American urgings that led India to buy a lot of oil from Russia. And Biden and one of the former ambassadors actually has revealed this, that the U.S. wanted to keep the price of the market for petroleum crude oil stable, and it wanted India to buy. And of course, India has its own reasons, because we are getting crude oil at a discount, and therefore it helped us to overcome our post-COVID problems. So. Since early August, things have started completely changing in our geopolitics. Started changing. India has now started becoming getting closer to China. Our Prime Minister went to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and we are supporting a lot of projects like the Iranian port in Chabahar. So what we are now, looking at is a situation where, our relation with China, which used to be extremely problematic, at least past 5 years, it was extremely problematic. This has now started changing. And future of the India-US engagement seems very uncertain in my view. We are not going to be finishing the trade agreement because of the sensitivity on agriculture. And India could actually be turning more towards China and possibly towards the global south, because this sort of rhetoric has now assumed center stage in all that we are hearing from the government. So and of course, there's a possibility of India re-engaging with RCEP grouping. I'll try and talk about it more if time permits later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Biswajit, and for keeping to time. Our next speaker is Rebecca Santa Maria. We're going from South Asia to Southeast Asia now.
Thank you very much, Shiro. Thank you very much to RIETI and ANU for the kind invitation to speak. I'm going to focus really on what Malaysia's ASEAN Chairmanship has done so far. It's coming to an end very quickly. By the 28th of October, it should be done and dusted. But there's a lot that has been done this year. So I'm going to focus on that. And not just from the government side, but also from the private sector. I will go through what the deliverables are for Malaysia's year this year. Looks very impressive on paper, but we can raise some questions on that. And what are the work in progress, basically, and what I think should be done next. And just a caveat, I'm taking this from an economic perspective, the economic pillar of ASEAN, and also the views I express are my own views, not that of the Malaysian government. So I have to have that out there. Very quickly, Malaysia has, as chair, has talked about 18 priority economic deliverables. So, and they're divided across 4 pillars. Trade and investment, which is our bread and butter. Inclusive and sustainable pathway. This is really linked back to the theme of Malaysia's year, promoting integration and connectivity, and building a digitally resilient ASEAN. Now, there's a whole bunch of deliverables under each pillar. I just want to highlight some things that I think is more significant than the others. For example, the ASEAN GCC China Summit. I think that was a very important first step in looking at how ASEAN would use its agency and its ability to convene across other groupings. I believe that we should also be focusing on groupings like the Pacific Alliance. We haven't done enough. ASEAN hasn't done enough with Latin America, for example. But the ASEAN GCC China is a first step, first very important step that Malaysia's taken. I think it's to their credit. Then the establishment of the ASEAN Geoeconomics Task Force, I'll talk about it later if we have time. That's an important body that was set up to deal with the situation that's happening today. The tariffs was prompted by the tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, but I think it has more than just the tariffs that it's been dealing with. Then the inaugural ASEAN economic ministers with the foreign ministers. In ASEAN, we have 3 pillars, and they pretty much exist on their own. And this is the first time, because of the way things are progressing today, you cannot have the separation with the economic pillar and the political security pillar. So having the 2 groups of ministers meet and look at things more holistically is important. And this year, next week, we will see the first meeting of the 2 groups of ministers. And we're also looking at the 5th ASEAN the RCEP meeting of the leaders. Then the others, let me just move on to the next set of deliverables. These are on investment as well as on energy cooperation. The ASEAN Power Grid, there's a lot of work that's being done and more needs to be done. The Center for Excellence for MSMEs, which are important to our respective economies, especially from the green transition perspective. The launching of the integrated semiconductor supply chain is one of the areas of focus this year, and I think that is where you will see a lot more work, especially as we discuss supply chain resilience. This work that we've started is important. Likewise, for tourism. I mean, I was in Kyoto over the weekend and really saw how busy and crowded Kyoto was, and next ASEAN has a very important tourism is very important to ASEAN, and so this tourism outlook is going to take on greater significance in the coming years. On the digital economy, this DEFA, the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, is a key deliverable. Was supposed to have been done this year. Unfortunately, you know how it is when you're negotiating 10 economies. There are various compromises that have to be made. And so what we will see this year is a substantial conclusion. Our ambition was to see a signing of this particular agreement this year. Unfortunately, we will be delayed. We will have substantial conclusion, but look at signing it next year. The startup scene is important for us. Especially for our younger people, and then the AI strategy. I think that's these are important steps that ASEAN has taken in this year. So the more significant thing, and the more valuable thing would be seeing the implementation of these initiatives. Really, it's always a good start, but the proof of the pudding would be really in how well we implement these initiatives. So unfinished business, you have the Digital Economy Framework Agreement, as I said. You have the establishment. We have announced the establishment. In May, we announced the establishment of the Women's Economic Empowerment Center. Now, if you try and find, if you go and Google this, there's not much information. It's still in early days. The center is supposed to be based in Malaysia. So I'm looking forward to this body being, really taking off. So much work to be done, and always the follow-through would really see how these initiatives materialize. RCEP, there's so much that needs to be done. We have done, Shiro and I have done op-ed piece on this. RCEP is so important for us, and yet there is, for me, again, the progress, the uptake is still too slow. In the meantime, the ASEAN +1 trade agreements that we established, that was the basis of RCEP. But we've gone on ahead to upgrade the +1 agreements while RCEP has stayed still. So we now need to really get our act together. When I say we, I mean ASEAN, and really look at having it in step with the +1 upgraded agreements. And then having a proper institution in place to ensure that RCEP is well communicated to the business community and implemented. And as I said, monitoring, ASEAN has a whole lot of initiatives. The essence of it, whether or not the effectiveness of it, will depend on how we monitor these initiatives. And of course, one of the more important initiatives, the power grid, we'll see how that gets implemented over the years. Besides the government, the private sector too has put in place this year very important initiatives. One is, as we talked about in the first session, supply chain resilience. The private sector under the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, they've gone ahead and established the ASEAN Supply Chain Coordination Council. Now, this was just established 23rd of September this year. It is about really focusing on how we can increase intra-ASEAN trade by looking at our supply chains. They've got a dashboard. This is completely private sector driven. They've put a dashboard in place to track the supply chains. And it's not theoretical. They've identified two products. So it's really a step-by-step approach. One is textiles, because it's important to at least 3 of our ASEAN member states. And the second is semiconductors, because that's another important product for a different set of ASEAN member states. So tracking, the whole idea is having this dashboard, tracking the whole supply chain, looking at the gaps, looking at what inputs would be required from government to ensure resilience along the chain. So quite a lot of work being done there by the private sector. The ASEAN business entity is another interesting initiative which has finally got approval. This would allow for inter-corporate transferees. So this is about, the whole thing is about facilitating business and ensuring that there can be the movement of skills across companies in ASEAN. This is something that the business community has been asking for the longest time. So finally, we're seeing some movement here. It was also announced in Malaysia's budget recently. And the third initiative is still pretty much a work in progress, is the ASEAN IPO prospectus. So if you issue a prospectus in Malaysia, for example, you can then have, it's not quite a twin listing, but you can have equity from other ASEAN member states as well. So a very interesting, innovative proposals coming in from the private sector. I'll stop here. We can continue later on what else ASEAN can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Professor KAWASE, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for having me here in such a wonderful, world opportunity. And in my, humble, the presentation, I will discuss what the rest of the world, excluding the United States, should do to preserve and reform the global trading system and avoid further the disorder. Where is the click? Okay. And let me start by reviewing the current situation. Since January, we have seen a series of the drastic change in the U.S. trade policy, and there is no doubt that the Trump tariffs are at the center of this development. And this new measure has three main pillars. First, the product-specific tariffs, imposed under the Section 232. And these target, the steel, aluminum, automobile, and even, wood products, all justified so-called on so-called national security ground. The second, the country-specific tariffs based on IEPA. And these are punitive the tariffs on the imports from Canada, China, Mexico, India, and Brazil, the countries that President Trump seems to dislike. And third, reciprocal tariffs framed as a fairness measures. They link the tariff level to the trade imbalance, claiming that if a country exports more to the United States than it imports, the United States is entitled to raise a tariff in response. The Turnberry system, in Jamison Greer's words, is a new trade order built on the bilateral deals and replacing the multilateralism itself. Instead of working through the WTO, the U.S. has conducted mini deals with several partners, including the UK, EU, and Japan, and Indonesia. These measures represent the serious, departure from the multilateral trade system, and they have a very deep systemic impact. The first, they undermine the rule of law. The United States has disregarded the WTO rules and procedures, and now paralyzed the appellate body by blocking the new appointments. And as a result, the system is drifting from the rule-based order to the power-oriented one. The second, they nullify the core principle of the WTO. By applying the different tariffs to the different countries, the MFN principle is being eroded. The past liberalization achievements are also being undermined as the United States ignores its tariff-binding commitments. And the third, there is an abuse of the national security exception. Even the imports of the kitchen cabinet have been labeled as a threat to the U.S. national security, which of course sounds very, very ridiculous. And this broad interpretation opens the door for any country to justify the protectionism on the political ground. So how should we understand this situation? As Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney recently said, the traditional relationship with the United States based on the deep economic integration has fundamentally changed. I completely agree. His comment marks a turning point. The post-war model of even ever closer transatlantic and trans-Pacific integration is no longer sustainable. At the same time, the WTO Director General Okonjo-Iweala reminds us that the United States now account for less than 15% of the global trade. That means more than 85% of the world trade is conducted by the rest of the world, most of which still want to preserve the rule-based multilateral trading system. That 85% give us a hope. So this slide represents a projection of the global trading system in the coming years. It may be a little bit, oversimplified, but as you can see, the 85%, even including China, are essentially in the same boat when it comes to supporting the multilateral trading system. So what should the 85% to do? Preserve and reform the system. The top priority is, of course, WTO reform. But no quick breakthrough is likely, since it is very difficult to reach a consensus that includes both United States, China, and even Global South. So so we need alternative measures to quickly, restore the rule of law in the global trade system. The first option is to adopt a standstill agreement. It's just, the political agreement, but it's very useful to preserve, prevent the further backsliding and to renew our commitment to the existing WTO rules. The second option is to expand membership of MPIA. This would help ensure the enforcement of the current WTO rule despite the appellate body dysfunction. So major WTO dispute settlement users such as Argentina, India, and Indonesia, and Korea are still not, were the partner to the arrangement and should be encouraged to join. At the same time, we should rebuild a middle power alliance, a coalition for free trade. The Ottawa Group at the WTO has played an active role in recent years. We could either reactivate or this forum or create a similar one. In that case, Japan, Australia, Canada, UK, and the EU should form as the core members. Together, they can engage in the collective bargaining with the United States to renegotiate unfair trade deals and normalize the trade relationship. By acting collectively, the middle power can increase their leverage and defend the integrity of the multilateral trading system. The next step is to leverage the mega FTA. The CPTPP should be at the center of this strategy, of course. For deeper integration, the party should promptly complete the 5-year general review and expand membership, especially to more ASEAN economies like Indonesia and Thailand, maybe Philippines. We should also promote the closer linkage between the EU and the CPTPP. As we have seen, the European Commission is now showing a strong interest in this idea. That said, EU accession to the CPTPP or creation of the comparable inter-regional mega FTA would be a major and long-term project. So in the short term, it would be more realistic to start with the practical cooperation on supply chain management, trade facilitation, and elimination of selected non-tariff barrier. If you looked at the IPEC, or the US-Taiwan 21st Century Trade Initiative, well, that can be a very good example, I guess. And finally, in the longer term, we must redefine the trade regime for the 21st century. Then let me highlight several key issues. First, the system must be greener. We should eliminate tariffs on environmental goods, for example, or introduce a new category of green subsidies and integrate the CBAM into the trade rules. And the second, it must be more digitalized, of course. We should develop the global digital trade rules more ambitious than the current JSI agreement on e-commerce and address AI governance as a new global issues. Third, the trade rules must deal more seriously with the security. We need a mechanism to prevent abuse the security exception. New rules for the trade in strategic sectors such as critical minerals or semiconductors, and stronger cooperation on the supply chain resilience. Finally, trade must be fairer. In the United States, the free trade is often, held responsible for hollowing out local manufacturing and weakening the middle class and widening the income gaps. To respond this kind of concern, we need a greater flexibility in adjusting tariffs, concessions, and trade remedies. At the same time, we must strengthen the oversight of the industrial subsidies and excess capacity and other non-market behaviors. So at the end of the day, the Turnberry system is very, very bad. I don't like it, of course. Does anybody like it? Maybe not. But, we can work it out if we work together. That is my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kawase-san, for raising all the issues in the multilateral system and proposing concrete ways forward. So, look, I've got a question each for our panellists before I open it up to questions from the audience. So please input your questions now while you can. Look, I'll start with you, Biswajit, on India. Look, India's policy choices could now be very crucial to the defence of the multilateral system. You listen to the rhetoric out of Delhi, it's about self-sufficiency and doing agreements with uncompetitive countries. Heard the foreign minister recently say that's why we're doing an agreement with the United Kingdom. Worried about doing deals or deepening deals in East Asia where India has a trade deficit. Now, India seems to be the only other country apart from the United States that cares a lot about having a trade deficit and feeling ripped off. So I guess I want to ask a two-pronged question. What is India's China strategy? You need Chinese foreign investment, Chinese intermediates to boost your exports. But also, what are the chances of a change in policy strategy out of Delhi to have better or more integration into the East Asian economy and to play a bigger role in the multilateral system?
Thank you, Shiro. I think the China issue, China question is now, I think, being seen in with a different lens. And like as mentioned, that there was an extreme hostility against China, and going back 5 years. Now this is actually changing, and this whole trade deficit with China was a major political issue. We're not hearing anything of that. And I might also mention here that only last week, China actually made an offer to India, invited India to join RCEP with an incentive. I think we heard this word in the earlier session, with an incentive that they will buy more from India. Now, I think it's a very interesting bargaining counter developing there, because we have always been very worried about lack of Chinese interest in importing from India. So I am quite hopeful that in the months to come, things will change because India is actually cozying up to China in many ways. So that is one. The second, of course, issue is more complicated, and I think there was an attempt made by India, and Professor Urata was asking this question before we came to this room about industrial policy and the relevance of industrial policy, and this was tried in India. That if industrial policy can be used to make the manufacturing sector more competitive and better participation. Now that's gone nowhere. So unfortunately, I think on this other question, I remain skeptical whether India is going to, sort of move out of the mindset that you talked about. But I think if the ice breaks on the RCEP side, and if the hesitancy to link up with China goes further, then I'm sure there's going to be a reverberation on the other side as well. So I remain hopeful of India's better participation in regional trading arrangements.
Thanks, and that RCEP, or a broader multilateral-like framework, can help India manage that China relationship that is already quite a big one and growing. Thanks. Let's turn to Rebecca and ASEAN now. I think, Rebecca, you underplayed really the success so far of ASEAN under Malaysia's chair this year, and that's perhaps because it's not over and there are still some risks. But I think, the success that ASEAN has had already shouldn't be understated. I mean, a coordinated response to not retaliate against Liberation Day tariffs, to coordinate across pillars in ASEAN, as you mentioned, the economic and political security, to set up this ASEAN Geoeconomic Task Force and so on. Do you think this is sustainable cooperation and coordination in the face of a flood of Chinese goods coming in to ASEAN, to Southeast Asia, that can no longer get into the United States? The United States that is pressuring countries to sign deals to reduce those tariffs. And I think the biggest challenge perhaps is in 10 days' time when Donald Trump is in Kuala Lumpur for the summits, and I understand is putting pressure on Malaysia to sign an agreement on reciprocal trade. That comes back to the Turnberry system deals that KAWASE-san talked about. Can you talk to us a little bit about the risks here and what that deal might involve?
Thanks. Just to be clear, the tariff rates for ASEAN range from between 10 and 40%. And it's some people are taking consolation in the fact that it was higher before. For example, Malaysia went from 25 to 19, and we're also grateful. But I think we have to be practical about it. It is not so much in the tariffs, but what is not stated. For example, we are not clear about the rules. We're not clear about for example, transshipment. I know it was mentioned in the first panel. What is Chinese content? The whole idea is to make sure that you do not, or you limit Chinese content in your exports to the US. But what is that? So that is one question that we are still not sure of. Again, as Jose says, the definition of transshipment is very different from how we understand transshipment. So that has to be really made very clear among ASEAN. What is our definition? How is ASEAN looking at transshipment? The other big question for us is, just to go back a bit, when you talked about what ASEAN's position is, we needed to have ASEAN was negotiating bilaterally. The member states, the 4 states were negotiating bilaterally. But what we said was, and that's not unusual for ASEAN. We are not EU. We can negotiate bilaterally. We've done it in the past. But what is important is that level of transparency among ASEAN member states and an understanding that we would share information about the status. I know there's also an NDA that we all signed with the US, but within those, there are parameters where we can do some sharing to ensure that there are some guidelines when it comes to this. One area is not just the transshipment, whether it's diversion or transshipment, that has to be sorted out. We need to have a clear definition, and I must say that in the report of the ASEAN Geoeconomic Task Force to the ministers, there is a whole chapter on how ASEAN should approach transshipment and trade diversion. So that's one. The other that is less talked about, but we must focus on, is the issue of most favored nation. The MFN issue has to be made very clear. ASEAN has an understanding among ourselves that if we give something better to a trading partner, then ASEAN member states have a right to ask for it or to seek clarification, especially if it's going to have an impact on our trade. So the MFN clause, how that is negotiated in the trade agreements, is so important. Agreement for reciprocal trade, that is something that we must pay attention to, especially from what we're hearing. Again, we haven't seen the details. What we're hearing about is if for example, if the US insists on future MFN, the rights to future MFN, so you're getting a free rider clause there. So ASEAN has to be very aware of that and make sure that we are united in our approach to the MFN principle in our negotiations. The others, I think, our negotiators can deal with those issues. When it comes to the tariffs part, I think ASEAN has that expertise. But I also want to just bring us back to what the business community is also telling the ministers. They said, they will continue. We did a survey, and they said that they will continue to invest in ASEAN. But here's what they need to ask. They need governments to do. One is to look at the rules of origin. Among ourselves, we need to streamline our rules of origin. We need to focus on trade facilitation. We need to implement our commitments. I think that's always been a bugbear for us, that we have many commitments, we don't really fully implement them. We need to facilitate movement of skills and coordinate industrial policies. These were the major asks from private sector.
Thanks, Rebecca. Look, we might continue on with the Turnberry deals and move to KAWASE-san. I like the way you talk about what the 85% should do, the rest of the world minus the United States. United States only accounting for 15% of global trade, of course. And this relates to a question from the audience. And the defense of the multilateral system by the countries that account for 85% of trade, the rest of the world. Don't these Turnberry deals, the deals the United States is pressuring countries to sign, completely undermine that effort of protecting the multilateral system? They are the biggest threat and assault on MFN, most favoured nation, and equal treatment. And just to remind, we do need equal treatment under a rule of law for this international system to work. Otherwise, as you say, it's a power-based system. So I guess that's the first part of my two-pronged question, the consistency here between the Turnberry deals and the ability to protect the system. Second is, you mentioned CPTPP and the mega-regionals. You didn't mention what both Biswajit and Rebecca raised, which is RCEP. How does RCEP factor into defense of the system for you?
Thank you very much. I mean, these are very, that's a good question. I will answer the first one, one by one. And, the Turnberry system, also undermines MFN principles, and even within the 85% community, as you suggested. When countries, will conclude the bilateral Turnberry, deals, they end up giving the United States more favorable, more treatment than they give to their other, trade partners. So in that sense, they are also, forced to commit the same kind of, violation with the MFN rules as the United States that does. So that's exactly, why I emphasize the importance of the standstill, or the agreement to reaffirm the shared commitment to the WTO rules and the principles. At least the 85% countries should maintain those basic multilateral the commitment among themselves, and even if some of them for the time being, unfortunately, have no choice other than making temporary the concession to the United States under the very unfair, political pressure. In the longer term, I believe 85% should work together, renegotiate the collectively with the United States to restore the normal rule-based the condition in the global trade. And your second question is RCEP. Yes, right. I certainly didn't mention the RCEP this afternoon. Just I wanted to focus on the potential linkage between EU and the CPTPP as a way to help maintain free trade order among 85% communities. Especially now, the European Commission has shown the very strong the interest in this idea. So I just think it deserves closer attention this afternoon. So let me make one thing clear. I am not dismissing the RCEP. RCEP is a very still important and continue to play important role in supporting a rule-based international trading system. Having said that, we also need to recognize some kind of limitations of the RCEP as a framework that could complement or partially replace the WTO. And for one thing, it does not include, the country from Americas and Europe. And in terms of both market access and the rules, RCEP maintains a less ambitious than CPTPP. So, for example, it doesn't have a commitment to the government procurement and no provision state-owned enterprise, and it does not sufficiently guarantee the free flow of data. Moreover, because China is a member of RCEP, there is a degree of a caution, of course. China is, of course, the very crucial trading partner for 85% community. But, given recent the cases of the economic coercion, the many countries are understandably hesitant to, deepen their economic dependence on, that country. In contrast, CPTPP, there is no China, there is no United States. So it could offer, a more stable and safe, the trade environment. And that is less vulnerable to the ongoing U.S.-China conflict. Yesterday, President Trump finally, acknowledged that, now U.S. and China in, like in a trade war. So given these circumstances, I believe that rather than focusing on deepening the RCEP, a more effective approach that would be bring additional ASEAN, the members into the RCEP. That would be a more practical and effective way to sustain and advance the free trade and rule-based the system among the 85%.
Thanks, Kawase-san. And look, in the interest of time, look, we have a few questions from the audience on the kind of avoiding the fragmentation of the global order and the importance of middle powers in this, because, as Kawase-san implied, it's very difficult. We're not going to be able to have Chinese leadership in this endeavour, although the Chinese will be able to lead with concessions they make. We can perhaps come back to that. The United States is an active threat to the multilateral system and moving us towards a power-based order. So the 85%, thinking about middle power leadership, I'll start with you, Kawase-san. Is there evidence of Japan working with other middle powers now, Australia, South Korea, or backing any ASEAN initiatives such as the RCEP Leaders Summit or Leaders Meeting to protect the region's multilateral interests? I know you talked about Europe a lot and elsewhere, but is Japan working with middle powers here, and what's the approach towards ASEAN?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But I have never, heard of that, kind of the movement. But when I talk to, several, government officials, some, senior, the officials, the level, they actually, secretly, was started to this kind of conversation. I'm not sure about that. It's just, the hearsay. So I'm not sure, it is really going or not. But, I kind of, expecting, the sooner or later, this kind of, movement will start, because, we don't have any other choice than, this kind of strategy. Sorry for a very shabby answer. Okay.
No, I agree. We're in a world of bottom-up cooperation and coalition building. So, if the cooperation's secretive and we're hoping it's happening, I'm not sure that that's enough if it is happening. Biswajit, over to you. India is, of course, the biggest by far economy in South Asia and looks at the rest of the world and dealing with big powers. I realise the relationship with Japan is very close and Australia, but what's the role of middle powers in working with India in the multilateral system?
Yeah, I think there has been some discussions about it, but I don't think it's gone up to that level. It has remained within the government. Even we don't hear anything that has gone beyond the discussions within the government, and I think it's very important that these issues are brought into the public domain so that there is more discussion. And I would encourage both sides. I would, the countries which are, Japan, for instance, Korea, who are talking to India, and to really come out more, in concrete terms, what they expect from India. I think here, as you know, that India has a very complex political system. And there is always, sort of assessment and reassessment of what the government does. And therefore, it's very important that we have this discussion in public domain so that there's a better assessment of what is going on inside closed rooms. And again, I've always been a big votary of most of these negotiations, including FTA negotiations, to be more transparent. Yeah, and of course, I know that several our trade partners have actually included a non-transparency clause in the negotiation. It doesn't help anyone. I think until the time the WTO was functioning, we knew most of what was happening. Of course, unfortunately, under the present DG, a lot of those documents have actually become restricted now. But earlier, a lot of these. So I think it's very important for us to keep the bilateral negotiations process transparent, up for public scrutiny, so that all the pluses and minuses of these discussions or the processes are then thrashed out. Until that happens, I think all these processes are not going to go anywhere, I think.
Thank you, Biswajit. Yeah, the importance of having these discussions, even at the track 2 level, like we're doing now, very important. Rebecca, over to you. No specific question, but please feel free to respond to any of the issues raised, including the middle power issue.
Yeah. No, I really believe that there is room for the 85%, the way you put it, 85%. I think that's important. But I think there's a lot more space for especially the more developing economies in RCEP than in CPTPP. CPTPP, it's the disciplines are of very high standard, I must say. But a lot of the 85% that you're talking about are folks that need to go up, right? And so a very good starting point is for us to do it in RCEP. That's one. Two, I always believe it's better to manage or to engage, let's choose words properly here, engage with China in the room than outside the room. So having China as your partner, and by the way, because of ASEAN's own initiatives to build regional economic integration, to deepen regional economic integration, our supply chains with China are very intertwined, and they've been there. They're very strong, and became stronger as we moved to RCEP. So to just talk about decoupling from China is very difficult for ASEAN because of the way it was a deliberate initiative. And my conversations with our business community, especially our SMEs, they're very comfortable and with having inputs from China, even as people, there is this whole conversation about oversupply of Chinese products coming into ASEAN. There is an equal number of folks who think that that is good for business and it creates jobs for SMEs in particular. So, I mean, so in that context, therefore, I really do believe that it's better to engage with China in RCEP than to have China outside and having a separate engagement at the CPTPP. Of course, in the ideal world, I would like to see CPTPP, RCEP, working, as a mega FTA.
Well, I think, if we start to think about RCEP and CPTPP working together, we'd want to just have them in the same strategic direction. Don't get trade negotiators involved. It'll be bogged down for decades. But it is important, I think, at this particular moment in time, that these mega regionals are mobilized and coordinated to head in the same direction. And that's where the 85%, as you mentioned, KAWASE-san, includes China, importantly, and China has a big stake in the established rules. So that's what we have to work with. And as many frameworks and as broad as they are, the broader they are, the better. So I think that does help us think middle powers and the frameworks that we can use to help support the multilateral system. I'm not going to keep talking because I get another chance to summarise right after this panel, but only to say thank you to the panellists who have helped us really think through these big issues of how to save the actual fabric of the global economic system so that we can keep our economies open and free. And so please join me in thanking our excellent panellists.